Have you ever heard the famous phrase, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes"? Well, this happened in this very battle, the Battle of Bunker Hill, or I guess we could say Breed's Hill. Following the beginning of Lexington and Concord, April 19, 1775, the citizens of Boston found themselves split between two armies. General Artemas Ward's New England's volunteers surrounded Boston and blockaded the surrounding land, while General Thomas Gage and 4,600 British soldiers held control of Boston itself. The American colonists knew that this was a sign of war. They were surrounded by 10 or 15,000 men from Roxbury to Cambridge, and every hour they were expecting attacked by either land or water. On June 15, 1775, the American colonists received information that the British planned to control the Charleston Peninsula, between the Charles and Mystic Rivers. There are two hills located on this peninsula, one named Bunker's Hill and one named Breed's Hill. Both hills overlook Boston and its harbor, making this a fantastic vantage point to be under the control of American colonists or the British Army, since the Americans knew that the Brits were going to attack. The colonists decided to act first to frustrate them. For this battle, on the American side, we have commanding Major General Dr. Joseph Warren, Israel Putnam, popularly known as Old Put, Colonel Stark, providing reinforcements, and William Prescott, who is known for the famous order, "Do not fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The Americans also have around 2,400 men fighting for their lives. On the opposing side of the fight, the British have commanding Sir William Howe, and General Thomas Gage. British also have Navy ships docked within the Boston Harbor, armed with cannons and about a tad more of 3,000 fully trained British soldiers ready to rip the Americans apart. On the night of June 16th, Colonel William Prescott led 1,200 of his undisciplined, disobedient, and sometimes intoxicated soldiers up to fortify Bunker's Hill, the dominant hill in Charlestown, Boston. Prescott, however, led up, building a barricade on Breed's Hill. Some believe that Prescott had a faulty map or led his troops in a different direction due to the dark setting. The following morning, after a long night, the British found Breed's Hill fortified with a barrier measuring a total of 160 feet by 30 feet high above their heads. The fact that the Americans were on elevated land, looking over the hill, gave them a tremendous advantage. Of course, the Brits were taken by surprise and angered about the Americans' masterpiece, as Major General William Howe knew that his men, under command and control of Gage, and it would take up to 6 weeks for his boys to construct such a barricade. The British ships organized their men, prepared their artillery, planned their strategy, loaded their cannons, and began to fire into the hill. At this time, Charlestown was consumed by fire. Everything was burning as the battle progressed. Bostonians and other people from the town climbed onto the rooftops to get a closer look at the battle and cheer on their own men. It was an intense moment that would leave the memory that no one could forget. So as the British ships were constantly firing cannonball after cannonball, they soon realized that their heavy artillery and main source of heavy contact was not being as strong as they originally thought. In response to their first attempted failure, General Gage ordered men to try and take control of the hill. It took Gage a very long time to issue a command, due to the shortage of boats and unfavorable tide, all thanks to the water in the Boston Harbor. When the British forces finally reached land, they quickly charged the American troops and their protection forces. The British just expected to march up the hill and scare the colonists away. The British troops started walking up the hill in their neat, crisp lines and making a sea of red little old men with bayonets fixed. Why should some redcoats even bother their muskets with firing loaded lead? The British troops, wearing the bright red heavy wool jackets, which were also weighed down with heavy equipment, marched up the grassy hill, trying to dodge the falling stones and bricks hidden beneath their feet. As the colonists saw this massive red line approach them, slowly but steadily, they remained calm and didn't open fire. The American colonists waited so long, it is their General Colonial Prescott has been said to have been given the famous order, "Don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes." The reason why Prescott enforced these commands was because 1. The colonists had very little ammo, so every shot counted, and 2. To keep the colonists with their muskets available in effective shooting range. Once the British came within visible range, the colonists began firing and the British started dropping like flies. The Brits were driven back down to the bottom of the hill and the Americans were victorious, but not for long. The British came up a second time, marching up the hill in their pristine lines, except this time, General Gage sent even more troops as reinforcements to once again attempt to conquer the hill. The American soldiers aimed their muskets low, shooting the chest and lower body, causing the Brits to fall to the ground when shot. This helps in preserving the ammo from missed shots to the head with the last of a musket ball and black powder from the colonists. Once again, the Americans forced the British back down the hill for a second time. British generals were angry and frustrated about the success that the Americans were having in the war, but were not going to let them win. On the British's last attempt, they were able to withstand the colonist rebellion. This time, colonists barely had any ammunition or supplies left. Men started to hurl rocks into the British crowd as they ran up the hill in their lines of red. Some of the American men fled at this point, while other brave soldiers stayed to guard the valuable hill. Dr. Warren told his men that the only way that they would gain freedom is if they fought for it. The British cut the breastwork and overran the redoubt from 3 sides. Colonel Stark managed to hold onto the rail fence on the side of the hill with reinforcements on the Americans' part long enough to help cover Prescott's retreat. Soon enough, the British broke through the wall, protecting the American colonists, aiming their bayonets and their muskets and all the American militia. Here's where the Americans, lacking combat skills, were dominated by the British, fancy spear attachments on their guns now. Almost all the colonists fled back up the peninsula since it was their only escape route, while the infiltrating forces were killing their honorable comrades who are left behind. At the end of the day, the British conquered Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. Even though the British claimed the land and counted the gain as a victory, it came at a deadly cost. The British suffered about 1,150 soldiers killed and wounded. The British troops were no longer fresh or overconfident. Instead, they were deeply frustrated. On the other hand, the American casualties were estimated that only 450 soldiers killed and wounded. This is a dramatic difference, a huge loss for Britain, and any spark of hope for the American colonists. For both sides, the Battle of Bunker Hill was the start of a journey of military education. The Brits came to realize that their frontal attacks were not very effective. The Americans proved to themselves and the rest of the world they could stand up to the British armies in traditional open field combat. The Battle of Bunker Hill was important for a variety of reasons. The first one being that it was the first battle in the American Revolutionary War. It showed that both sides of this war were not going to fall easily. Each force fought with pride and determination. It simply foreshadowed that it was going to be a long, close war. Another important point that this battle had was it allowed the American troops to actually see that the British armies were not invincible. The aftermath of how many were killed on the American side versus how many were killed on the Britain side brought confidence to the Americans as a whole and showed that they did have a chance. Forever be remembered that the Battle of Bunker Hill, which actually took place on Breed's Hill, as the cornerstone of the American Revolutionary War, and the foundation of hope on defeating the British for a new free nation.